Let's take a look at what could be called the Republican death calculation. As this is being recorded, 1 in 500 Americans have died of COVID. Some states, especially my adopted state of Florida, are facing a healthcare crisis as hospital ICUs fill up with COVID patients. The fact that most of these unfortunate people are unvaccinated shows the sad fact that this was an easily avoidable crisis. Getting a safe and effective vaccination would have protected these people, and following the various health protocols, such as enduring wearing a mask, would have also probably helped. While these people did choose to remain unvaccinated, presumably, Republican politicians and their allies have been instrumental in enabling COVID to continue to plague America. Opposing mask and vaccine mandates has become seemingly the default position of the Republican Party. This is exemplified by the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. Rather than simply not imposing statewide mask or vaccine mandates, he has actively used the coercive power of the state to prevent local governments and school boards from having their own mandates. To be fair, he has encouraged people to get vaccinated, as he has been vaccinated, as Trump and most Republican politicians have been vaccinated. But he seems to have started courting the anti-vax portion of his base. Now, while DeSantis has spoken of medical authoritarianism, and he and other Republicans speak about freedom, this seems to be a bad faith argument. After all, DeSantis and his fellows have been busy using the coercive power of the state to do such things as ban critical race theory from public schools, where it really wasn't being taught, and impose various trans bans. These impositions are aimed at imaginary harms and impose on meaningful freedoms, such as the freedom of expression and the freedom to, have ideas that go against, say, the ruling elite of society. While I do agree that people do have the basic right of bodily autonomy, this right, like all rights, is limited by the principle of harm. The freedom to refuse a safe and effective vaccination during a pandemic does not seem to be a legitimate freedom, and can be compared to the freedom to decline to have operating brakes on your car. You become a danger to yourself and others. DeSantis and the other Republicans do certainly seem to recognize the harm of the pandemic. As noted earlier, they've been encouraging people to get vaccinated. So why are they not supporting mandates, or at least allowing local governments to impose them? The obvious answer would be politics. Plain and simple. Now, going back to the start of the pandemic, Trump and his various allies spent months presenting the pandemic as a hoax, downplaying it, and pushing various snake oil cures. They also seem to have either tapped into or caught the attention of the anti-vax folks. Now, after Trump was soundly defeated in a legitimate election, there was a brief attempt by Republicans to give Trump credit for the vaccine. Now, to be fair to the Republicans, it is likely that most of them did want and do want Americans to get vaccinated, and they want to get the pandemic over with. Now, interestingly, Trump even made an attempt to convince his own followers to get vaccinated. The response was kind of shocking. They booed him for making this suggestion. This sent a clear message to Trump and his Republicans. A loud portion of the base had seemingly become anti-vax. Testing things out, they found that using the power of the state to prevent vaccine and mask mandates was also popular with the base. One can hear the cheers from their supporters when such announcements are being made. And sadly, if one listens closely enough, one can also hear the dry coughs of the ghosts of the future. As such, even if Republican politicians truly wanted to support the mandates, or at least to not oppose them, they cannot do so now without a high political cost. Such a rational and ethical act would open them up to a primary attack from a challenger with even less ethics. And they're not going to do that. Now, again, to be fair to the Republicans, many of them probably hoped they could cash in on being anti-mandate and appease their base while everyone else got vaccinated and brought the pandemic to an end. After all, for a brief moment, it seemed like we were emerging from the pandemic. Things were seemingly normal. You could go out, mask mandate, the mask requirements were being lifted, you go out in public. I was able to go back and start running races, back in the classroom. Things were looking up. And so the pandering probably did not seem dangerous at the time. But then the Delta strain arrived, and COVID cases surged again. Now, rather than taking the morally correct action of fighting this surge, the Republicans doubled down and stuck with this base. Making this decision presumably involved a rational death calculation. As I noted in an essay I wrote some time ago, the Republicans seem to be gambling that their gains will outweigh their losses in terms of votes. On the plus side, in terms of the positive, getting votes tally, the votes Republicans will gain by their positions and those they will keep by their positions are pluses. Now, a voter who votes for Republican because of this anti-mandate approach, but who would otherwise vote for a Democrat, is what could be called a double plus. The Republicans, get a vote, and the Democrats lose one. So, double gain. Gaining or keeping a voter who would not otherwise vote for a Democrat is only a single plus, but still a plus. Now, each voter who dies, who would have voted for a Democrat, is also a plus for Republicans. As this is being recorded, Black Americans have had the highest COVID-19 death rate. This is due to a variety of reasons, such as the fact that Black Americans generally have less access to healthcare than white Americans. But of course, it's worth noting that access to healthcare is a problem for everybody. But it does hit certain people harder than others. As is, clearly established, Black Americans do tend to vote for Democrats. So the death of black voters, terrifyingly and horrifyingly, would be a plus for Republicans in general, because there would be less people voting for the Democrats, because those voters would be, dead. Now, on the minus side are the votes that Republicans would lose because their voters are dying from COVID, because a dead Republican voter can't vote either. COVID is hitting Trump, what we could call Trump territory, especially hard. Republican strongholds, the areas that went, really hard for Trump, those are, not surprising, the areas getting hardest hit by COVID. And so there could be enough deaths to meaningfully impact elections in the future. After all, the elections are often in areas, can be quite close in certain areas. And places like Florida, Georgia, etc., Republicans often win by very thin margins. And so the death of many Republican voters, even a relatively small number, could have an impact. Now, also on the minus side are votes that might be lost because of negative views of Republican COVID policies. These are voters who would have otherwise voted Republican, but they do not because of their disagreement with these policies and their impact. For example, a voter who loses their husband to COVID and does not vote for Republican because of this would be a lost vote for the Republicans. A Republican would, of course, suffer a double loss if the voter who would have voted for them votes for the Democrat instead. So that's the basic calculation. Pluses and minuses based on deaths and responses. Now, Republicans are, of course, not depending on their COVID stance to win upcoming elections for them. They've also been busy gerrymandering, forcing a recall, like in California, which they failed, although they essentially put $300 million of taxpayer money in a pile and set it on fire. So that's, I guess, fiscal conservatism. And of course, engaging in the very infamous voter suppression. Now, if the pandemic horribly and tragically kills enough Republican voters, they'll need to increase their efforts in these areas. Republicans are also a numerical minority party. They are overrepresented because of, again, gerrymandering and voter suppression, and so they'll really have to up their game on this if the pandemic claims more Republican voters, which is horrible and unfortunate because people should really not be dying of COVID at this point. So, stay safe, and I will see you in the future.